Well, good afternoon, saints. This is the Bible study I've been promising here. This is the Day of the Lord Bible study, picturing the Day of the Lord in Revelation. Specifically, I believe it occurs at the very end of Revelation 6, the wrath of the Lamb is the comment. So let's go through the Bible study. If you didn't see the conclusions video I posted yesterday, I walked through all the conclusions in about 20 minutes, and this is the actual Bible study that supports it. So if you didn't see the conclusions video and you want just a short what's he talking about, go watch that. If you're ready for the whole Bible study, I think this might take a little bit, but that's what today's effort is. So the order of the events are important, and the first thing I want to show is that the church is in heaven before any of Revelation 6 occurs. And I think the easiest way to see this is take a look at the elders, which is a picture of the church in heaven. And this isn't my opinion. This is brought forward by a lot of scholars. But I'm just going to conclude or summarize here with these following observations. Let's read the verse or two here about the elders, and then we'll make some comments over here on the right. And round about the throne were 24 seats, and upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold. And already you can see there's a bunch of descriptive items here about the elders. They have crowns of gold, clothed in white. They're sitting on thrones. They're called elders, and there's 24 of them. So almost right away in one verse, you can see a whole bunch of facts or attributes of these elders. Let's go now into Revelation 5 and see a little bit more. Starting in verse 6, and I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb that had been slain, having 7 horns, 7 eyes, which is the 7 spirits of God. And he came to the book in the right, and he came and took the book out of the right hand, him that sat upon the throne. And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps, golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song. Now the antecedent topic here is the elders. So they sang a new song, Thou art worthy to take the book, to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood, out of every kindred, tongue, people, and nation, and hast made unto us, God, kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. And just look here, we picked up a few more items. We're called a kingdom of priests, or kings and priests, to God. And so, and they also note that they're redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. So there's all of our attributes. And the reason why these attributes are important is you only need to go back to Revelation 2 and 3, the letters to the church, and you can see the same promises. The church was promised crowns. The church was promised that we'd have white raiment. Here in Revelation 5, we're redeemed, but we know that already from the Old Testament, or from the New Testament, that we're redeemed. That we're going to sit on thrones with Jesus, Revelation 3, another promise fulfilled. The fact that we're elders, that's already attributed to the church in Timothy and Acts, you can see. That we're a kingdom of priests, that shows up in Revelation 1, and here again in Revelation 5. And the fact that there's 24 of them, we actually see a pattern from the Old Testament when King David chose 24 elders, the heads of their family units, to serve in the temple that Solomon was to build. And the church is called a kingdom of priests. That's a picture from the Old Testament that the church is now fulfilling. And 24 of them were 24 family heads or elders were chosen to serve in Solomon's temple by King David. 24 elders here are serving Jesus. So you see a type and an antitype. So I think that's a real solid indication, a very simple study to see that the promises to the church in Revelation 2 and Revelation 3 are all fulfilled in the picture of the elders. The one that I think is the slam dunk is this Revelation 5 through 10. Let's read it again. And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, everyone of them having harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. So these elders are holding the prayers of the saints. And they sung a new song, Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred, tongue, people, and nation, and has made unto us, our God, kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. And as I mentioned before, the church was what was redeemed from the New Testament. And the fact that we are a kingdom of priests, or kings and priests, was promised to the church in Revelation 1. And so I don't think there's any other way of cutting it. Now, I know if you're looking at a newer translation, you can see a pronoun difference here, personal pronoun difference. I'm looking at the ESV now. Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seal, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people. And you see how the personal pronoun is basically dropped there. It doesn't say ransomed us. It says ransomed people. And I just want to tell you that that has to do with the translation technique chosen by the translator. The King James Version uses a majority text, or the Byzantine text, which is the majority of the scriptures available, the copies available at the time. What was the wording? And then they chose that to be the preference wording for their translation. In the case of what's called the newer translations, many of them used one copy of one Greek text, the Alexandrian text type, that had a them and a they, making this not a personal statement here, but making it a generic, anybody in heaven could have sung this song. And what was frustrating about this, and Dr. Andy Woods brings out this point, 23 of the 24 oldest Greek texts that are in existence today use the personal pronouns we and us. And it's only one text, the Alexandrinus text, that says they or them. And according to Dr. Woods, he thinks it's basically unconscionable that the translators would so doggedly hold to, quote, the oldest transcript being the one you follow, when 23 of the 24 oldest transcripts use the we and the us. And so I guess for the point of this video, I think these are powerful verses, and it fulfills the promise again made to the church. So it's almost like you don't need the elders to sing the song talking about we and us being redeemed by Jesus' blood. You still have the promise of making us kings and priests to God, which is sitting there, promised to the church in Revelation 1:6. So I just wanted to make sure you guys first see that this is the church in heaven before we get to any other debate about Revelation 6. Now that we sort of established that the church is in heaven in Revelation 4 and 5, the question is does the tribulation period start at the rapture of the church? I think that's a very common view. You can see it in a lot of commentaries, or at least it's presumed, because they put the seals during the time of the tribulation. And yet, it's obvious actually that the rapture of the church does not trigger the tribulation period. What triggers the tribulation period is actually a covenant that gets confirmed. So let's go first take a look at that, and then we'll come back and build on the arguments that there's a gap between the rapture of the church and the start of the tribulation period, which is also called Daniel's 70th week, which is also called the time of Jacob's trouble, has a bunch of names. But let's go take a look at that first in Daniel 9. So Daniel 9:27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured out on the desolate. So that you can see here in Daniel 9:27 that the confirmation of a covenant for 1 week or 7-year period is what triggers the tribulation. Tribulation is a 7-year period. And in the midst of the week, he will stop the sacrifice and oblation, meaning the Jewish people will be for 3.5 years using the temple for the Jewish Torah laws, the temple laws that they're trying to fulfill and follow. And in the midst of that week, the he here is the Antichrist will stop and basically not follow his covenant that he made. He will stop the oblation. He'll stop that. And for the overspreading of abomination, he'll make it desolate. We don't have time to get into how this was a prototype of this happened to the Jews already back with Antiochus Epiphanes in about 187 BC. But that's where you can get the picture and the confirmation of what this verse really means, is that they'll have the covenant for a week, but then about halfway through, the Antichrist will put an end to their temple sacrifices. And so for the Jewish people, that will be a major event. So we see if the covenant is the thing that starts the tribulation period, that there must be a gap, or presumably there's a gap between the rapture of the church and the start of the tribulation period, because the covenant has to be confirmed, or at least it has to be completed and then confirmed, depending on how you view those verses in the original language. But let's go back to Revelation 6 now and take a look at one more of these arguments here that Bill Salas makes about the gap that must be there between the rapture of the church and the start of the tribulation period. Here you can see the book I'm talking about from a Bible teacher, Bill Salas, an author. And in previewing this book, I didn't read the whole book, but he said something very interesting several years ago that I had already caught on to, and I'll show you the part that I had found. But Bill Salas said that there must be a pre-tribulation time gap. He calls it a mystery, but he's basically arguing again the same point, that the tribulation period can't start at the rapture of the church. Now let's go take a look at the verses that he built that argument on. Here at the fifth seal, Revelation 6:9, and when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge the blood of them that dwell on the earth? And so his point that Bill makes here is that if the tribulation period had already started, why would the souls under the altar be asking God, when are you going to avenge our blood? Because the point of the tribulation period is to avenge, or to put down the wicked of the earth and bring the Jewish people to their Messiah, Jesus. And so Bill's point is, these souls under the altar wouldn't be asking, when's that going to happen, Lord, if it had already begun. And I thought that was a very powerful argument. And so Bill Salas would say the day of the Lord can't start at least until after seal number 5. And I thought that was fantastic. Now, Bill Salas has been a Bible teacher and an author for quite a while, but you also want to have some confirmation, at least I do, with commentaries and people that are in the academic realm, in case a lay Bible teacher has missed something. So I was studying a few weeks back. I was about to teach the major themes in the book of Revelation to my church. So I went back through and I was looking at teaching and commentary, and Dr. Andy Woods again confirmed that it's the confirmation of the covenant that starts the tribulation period, not the rapture of the church. And so he was reflecting on there must be this gap of time between the rapture of the church and the start of the tribulation period for simple reasons like the Antichrist needs to establish himself. He doesn't show up on the scene, apparently, until you get the first seal open in Revelation 6, verses 1 and 2. He has to come to power, and then these wars begin and all this. And so there could be a gap now. Dr. Andy Woods said this actually harkens back not to current day teaching and theologians, but he said a few decades prior, the theologians already had identified this, and so he pointed people back to Dr. John Walvoord, who was a famous Dallas Theological Seminary professor, and that got me going. I looked at John Walvoord's stuff, but I also, in doing that, ran across another Dallas Theological Seminary professor, Dr. Thomas Constable, which I thought made the arguments even better. He's basically making the argument that I'm doing in this video today. So let me bring up a little part of that commentary, and you can see, what I got excited about. So this is a Bible commentaries by Dr. Thomas Constable, and I've got this at studylight.org. I will note this one difference before we get going too far. The timing of these sealed judgments, when are they? And premillennial scholars believe the seal picture events that are part of the tribulation, and he refers that to Dr. Walvoord and Dwight Pentecost here. I favor that second view. The seals, trumpets, and bowls seem to fit best this last 7-year period which Daniel prophesied. And so I think, he's sort of arguing for a view that the rapture of the church sort of starts the tribulation period if the seals are part of the tribulation. But what's interesting to me is if you come all the way down to his commentary on verse 17, which is let's go to the second to last, the verses 12 to 17. This is where the last seal is being opened, and the entire passage and every clause utilize well-known prophetic anticipations of the day of the Lord, and by his use of the images, John identifies the day for readers. One may check this out, and we're going to get into Joel and all these. So that I thought was key, that he's identifying the language in the last seal with the day of the Lord. And let's come down to verse 17, where it's the last verse in chapter 6, where it says, the great day has come, who can stand? And here the commentary in verse 17 says, this great day of wrath is the tribulation, Daniel's 70th week. So whether he views the tribulation period starting here at the end of the sixth seal, or whether he thinks the seals, if he's just saying generally the tribulation period begins with the seals from the comments I read above, I couldn't quite make it out. But the important thing I got from this commentary is that he sees the language of the last verse in chapter 6 of Revelation, talking about the great day of the wrath has come as equaling the tribulation period and Daniel's 70th week. I'll also note, and I don't have time to kind of read through all the comments, but he also talks about the difference between the war and the description of the battle in Joel 2 as it's differentiated from Joel 3. And we're going to make a big point of some of that a few minutes from now, but I get a lot of encouragement that here's a 45-year professor teaching at Dallas Theological Seminary that sees the language at the end of Revelation 6 as the part that signals the tribulation period, Daniel's 70th week, and he's actually down here saying it's the day none like it. It's the time of Jacob's trouble, and everybody that views those passages in Jeremiah knows that there's a time of Jacob's trouble is another name for the tribulation period, and so we're going to pick up on that as well. Okay, so we've noted a handful of theologians that validate that the gap exists between the rapture of the church and the start of the tribulation period. And Dr. Thomas Constable actually says the tribulation period language matches the last verse or two there in Revelation 6, and that's the point that we're going to get to in this whole video. Let's go take a quick look at those last two verses, and then I'll go back and show you what triggered me first looking into all this. And so the last few verses, so you can see it, Revelation 6:16 says, "And he said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come. Who shall be able to stand?" And so you can see the great day nomenclature and wrath, and actually the tribulation period, the whole period. There's a couple of verses in the Old Testament that talk about it's a time of God's wrath. And so it doesn't necessarily mean the second half of the tribulation period or some portion of the tribulation period. The day of wrath is one of those idioms, you could say, that signifies the tribulation period in general. So let's take a look now at what first got me going, thinking that the day of the Lord might be pictured somewhere here in Revelation 6 at the end of the sixth seal. And it had to do back in 2015 with the blood moon tetrad craze. And everybody was looking at, that the blood moons were occurring on these Jewish feast days, and there was books written and all that. And so I went into the Bible and I was looking for I knew about the moon turning to blood in a couple of passages, and I thought, well, where is that, and where do you find that? And so, I ran into Revelation 6:12, and I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And I thought, wow, that's it's yet future. Maybe these blood moon tetrads are something. I wasn't sure. That's I just knew that the church would be gone though before the actual blood moon event that means something was going to happen. But during those days in 2015, with all the hype going on, a lot of people were pointing to Acts 2 that has the exact same language. So let's go take a look at Acts 2. So here I'm in Acts 2, Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. And if folks don't know, Pentecost is the Greek name, but the festival of Pentecost was really for the Jews. It was the Feast of Shavuot, which is one of the required feasts, 3 feasts of the year. All males and all of Judaism were supposed to come to the temple to celebrate. And so that's why at Pentecost here, Peter stands up and he gives his speech, and 3,500 people come to the Christ during this speech. He can preach to that many people because they're all there for the Feast of Shavuot. And so that, with a little bit of that context, we can read this. But this is that which was spoken of the prophet Joel. And it shall come to pass in the last days, said God, that I'll pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaids I'll pour out in those days my spirit, and they shall prophesy, and I will show wonders in the heaven above, signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall turn into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord comes. And it shall come to pass, whoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now those verses are a direct quote out of Joel 2, right at the end of Joel 2. But if you notice something, at least I thought it was odd. Yes, the Spirit fell on those folks in the day of Pentecost, but if you look at the other events that's recorded here in Acts 2, verse 1 through 13, it doesn't talk about the sun going black and the moon to blood. It's not mentioned. And so I thought, why is Peter quoting all those other parts of Joel 2 if that's not happening on this day? And so, I did videos back in 2015 about it, and then later I had some insight, and I did some more videos in 2019 about it, but I think it was just in the last couple of weeks here that the Lord sort of gave me the more full download, which we'll get to just in a little bit. So the point here that started me on this whole trek is Acts 2, Peter's speech at Pentecost, referencing the sun going dark and the moon to blood before that great day. Now, I know there's lots of scholars. I'm trying to think of a couple of names for you here. But scholars that will say, well, maybe what this means is the church age is the last age, and so it's the last days starting with the birth of the church age. And I don't think that's what's up here at all. I'm just thinking here, I think is Dr. John MacArthur, I heard him preach that's the meaning of why he was quoting before that great day. And he was saying that means the church age is the last days. But there's too much context to the day of the Lord to just throw it about like that, in my humble opinion. And so let's get into this a little bit deeper here in a few minutes. But I want to finish. So if there's this gap, what is in the gap? If the tribulation hasn't started, what are we to think of these seals being opened? And I think that's a great question. And so the first thing I want to drill into is the Jewish context of what's going on here. Now, in Revelation 6, let's just talk about this for a second here. You have the first seal, the Antichrist coming. The second seal, war breaks out in the world. The third and fourth seal, a bunch of people on the earth die, and we'll get into more details on that. The fifth seal is the martyr of Christians, and the sixth seal is the wrath of God and disaster. And you see that actually in the Synoptic Gospels, the exact same progression. I want to go take a look in Matthew here, but false Christ, and then the Antichrist comes, wars and rumors of war, war breaks out, famines and pestilence, that's the third and fourth seal, persecution and martyrs, fifth seal, earthquakes and disasters, God's wrath, they're in the sixth seal. And so I think I might have gotten this from Dr. David Jeremiah, or I know he preaches this, but I saw this in several commentaries, this kind of chart. Chuck Missler also has this chart. And so it's a common view that the birth pangs can be associated with the seals. And so if the Revelation 6 seals are birth pangs, then we haven't gotten to the tribulation period yet. So it's an argument I'll make about this. And so let's go to Matthew 24. I just want to show you that this is all sitting in there. So starting in verse 4, and Jesus answered, "Take no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." Well, there's your false Christ, right? "And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So there's your wars and rumors of wars. "For nation shall rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in diverse places." Famines, pestilence. See, it matches the picture we get in seal 3 and 4. "And all these things are the beginning of sorrows." And so there's the birth pangs. And then they shall deliver you up and may be afflicted and kill you, and you shall be hated by all nations. There's martyrdom. Boom. And then you shall be offered up and shall betray one another and be hated by one another. And many false prophets shall rise and deceive many. And because of iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world for a witness unto all nations. And so you've got that parallel all the way down, including the earthquakes and disasters. That's the seal 6 stuff, and you get that in verse 7, pestilence, earthquakes, and diverse places. And so it's inclusive of the 6th seal is still birth pangs. And so I thought I would bring that up. Now, there's something really neat that you can look at here in Matthew, and I think a lot of people miss the Jewish context of Matthew. If you look at any commentary on Matthew, a lot of times it'll start the prefix of the commentary saying Matthew is the most Jewish gospel. And they point to all the times Matthew references this is to fulfill what was in the scripture, meaning the Old Testament. And so Matthew keeps making a point that we're fulfilling scripture with Jesus, in his first coming. And he paints a picture. My argument is, in Matthew 24 and 25, what's going to happen to the Jewish people that haven't accepted Christ? Because if you accept Christ, you're part of the church. Now there's no free bond Jew, male, female. I forget the quote there from Paul. But if a Jewish person accepts Christ, they're part of the church. Matthew's gospel is to call the Jewish people to their Messiah. And so when we're in Matthew 24 and 25, I'll argue that he's not preaching to the church at all. It's not in view. And Dr. Andy Woods does a great job. He's got a whole video. If you go through his comments on this, he lays it out wonderfully about Matthew starting in 23 and going to 25. And so I'm just going to summarize the point being made here about Matthew's gospel being for the Jew that hasn't accepted Christ. In Matthew 23, 1 through 36, Jesus condemns the religious leaders. And so you can see, woe to the scribes and Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites and whitewashed tombs, and he really goes after the fact that they're being righteous unto themselves, that they're rejecting the historical words that God had given them. And, it couldn't have been more harsh condemnation. So it's to the Jewish corporate leadership at that point. Then at the end of Matthew 23, he says, for I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth until you say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And so Jesus is telling them, until you call for me, you're not going to see me again. So again, Jesus talking directly to the Jewish leadership, the corporate Jewish folks. When we go to chapter 24, nothing has changed. It's still the Jewish context. And so what's the next thing? Now Jesus gives them a little foretelling. He tells them about the destruction of their temple and that their house is going to be taken because of their lack of belief. So what's the next step in the Jewish program that don't accept Christ? Not the church age, not the apostles going out, not the martyrdom. No, it skips over all that and goes to the destruction of the temple. Then what's the next thing? It comes to the end of the age. Why? Because the church age isn't in view. It comes right to the birth pangs because the Jewish folks that haven't accepted Christ go into, miss the rapture of the church and go into the sealed judgments. And so there you got the sealed judgments. And I just want to make this really neat point. You've got the sealed judgments, and the last part of that is, and the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached into all the world for a witness. Well, that's sitting right there in Revelation 7, the sealing of the 144,000 Jewish evangelists. And so inclusive of the work of the then converted Jewish people, you have the seals being opened and then the kingdom being preached. What happens next? You skip the trumpet judgments and you're into the midpoint of the tribulation period. Why are the trumpet judgments missed for the Jewish people? I'll argue because they signed a covenant with death and Sheol that the overflowing scourge won't come to them. And God says at the end, actually, of Ezekiel 38-39, war, that he's doing this to make his name holy. And so I think when the armies are put down at the end of the Ezekiel 38-39 war, and we'll see this in a minute, God is saying that they'll know that I am their God, but yet we know the Antichrist signed a covenant with the Jewish people. We saw that in Daniel 9:27. And so I think once again that corporately the Jewish people are going to have to decide, do they trust God's word and God's miracles that validate it, or do they trust, Satan and his spokesman, the Antichrist, claiming that it's the covenant that they signed that protected them? And so they're going to miss those trumpet judgments, because what we see in verse 27, that halfway through the week, the oblation will cease, and the Antichrist will put an end to it. So what do we have? Halfway through the tribulation period picks up the next event that you see in Matthew, and that's the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. And so you're at the midpoint of the tribulation there. So these verses, Matthew 24:15 through 20, are the midpoint of the tribulation. And then Matthew 24:21 through 28 is the second half of the tribulation period, inclusive of the bowl judgments. And so you actually see how nicely this lays out. The trumpet judgments are the first half, and for the Jewish people, they're under that covenant with death and Sheol, and they're actually not experiencing probably the trumpet judgments. And yet when the end to the sacrifice and oblation happens and the abomination is set up at the midpoint of the tribulation period, then they're told to flee to the mountains. Why? Because there will be trouble, great tribulation that was not since the beginning of the world till now. And so the second half then of the tribulation period, many of the Jewish people will go through, but they're being told then they should also flee to the mountains. And so some of the Jewish people in Jerusalem and Judea will be protected when they flee to the mountains. So I hope you can see the Jewish context of all of this. And here in Matthew 24, we see actually that these birth pangs aren't part of the tribulation period. So the whole thing confirms that the birth pangs are leading up to the tribulation. And again, to me, that points to there's a gap between the rapture of the church and the actual start of the tribulation period. I know we're kind of belaboring this point, but I want you to see not only is there a gap, but that it extends to the end of the seals being opened. And so the one other thing we can pick up on is in Revelation 5. We've got one other reference here that's interesting. I saw on the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And so Jesus has the sealed scroll in his hand in Revelation 5, and yet these seals are going to get opened then in Revelation 6. So first thing you can say about that is you can tell it's in chronological order. The church is in heaven. Jesus gets the scroll in his hand. It has 7 seals on it. And it's not until the seals are being opened in Revelation 6 that a bunch of these bad things start happening down here on earth. So it's one more confirmation that the church isn't appointed to any of that, because Jesus just got the scroll in Revelation 5 and the church is already in heaven. But then we can say, well, what's in that scroll? And I'd say there's 2 probably three popular things. One is it's the title deed to earth, which I prescribe to that. The other is it could just be depicting here a Roman will or testament, and I'm fine with that too. It's probably the same thing. But I just want to point out a commentary I read here on these seals. When a scroll was finished, it was fastened with strings, and the strings were sealed with wax at the knots. The scroll was sealed with 7 seals. There were 7 strings around the scroll, each string sealed with wax. These were not 7 writings, each separated by a seal, but 7 seals upon one scroll. All the seals must be opened before the scroll could be read. And I'd like to make that point because when we see in Revelation 6 these seals being opened, if it is the title deed to earth, or if it is Jesus getting his inheritance, right, either way, the scroll has to be open before the redemption begins. So, the 6 seals need to be open, and you say, well, what about that 7th seal? The 7th seal itself is the trumpet judgments. And so, you have to be past the 6th seal, because when the 7th is open, the trumpet judgments are happening. And you can see that right at the beginning of Revelation chapter 8. So another thing that confirms that the gap between the rapture of the church and the actual day of the Lord beginning is supported with the notion of those seals need to be open for the redemption to begin. Now the next part of this study, it's a little bit more involved, if I haven't already said enough. Because what we need to see is how the book of Joel gives us all sorts of pointers as to when the day of the Lord is, and you can relate that to the book of Revelation, but you do that linking through the war of Gog of Magog. And so I was blessed several years ago reading a commentary by Pastor Chuck Smith, who, Calvary Chapel founder, and he popularized this notion of verse by verse teaching through the whole Bible, and he definitely was not afraid of eschatology and teaching the end times. And he made this curious comment in his one of his commentaries that, did you notice the similarity between a lot of the statements in the war of Gog of Magog, Ezekiel 38:39, with what you find in Joel, specifically in Joel 2? And I thought, what? What are you talking about? And so it's a very neat study, and I have here the parallel verses and the parallel thoughts, and there are many. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, is there are many parallels there that we can go into, but I'm almost afraid to start reading this because there are so many verses we can go through to show that these are parallel thoughts. But I mean, in Ezekiel 38:8, it occurs in the last days, and right away in Joel 1, it says that alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand, and a destruction from the Almighty. And it starts there and it goes all the way down. What's the last thing you see in Ezekiel 39? Neither will I hide my face any more for them, for I have poured out my spirit upon them, the house of Israel, saith the Lord. And what do you get right at the end of Joel 2? And it shall come to pass afterwards that I'll pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and the handmaids in those days I'll pour out my spirit. And so you can see all the parallelism in the language, and I thought, wow. And so I believe if you study the prophet Joel 1, he's introducing an army, and they're not going to be altogether human, I'll argue, by the time he depicts them in Joel 2. And all the verses he uses about this army is picked up in the Ezekiel 38:39 war, again making some reference to the army that fights it, sort of on the the satanic side, the Gog side of the army, is described in very similar language, including even what happens when the war is done. They're buried in the valley of Hamon-Gog, and the stink rises up. And let's see here. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will give unto Gog a place of graves in Israel, the valley of the passengers on the east of the sea, and it shall stop the noses of the passengers, and there they shall bury Gog and his multitude, and they shall call it the valley of Hamon-Gog. Listen to this parallel verse. But I will remove far off from you the northern army, and will drive him into barren, desolate land, with his face toward the east sea, and his hinder part toward the uttermost part of the sea, and his stink shall come up, and his ill savor shall come up, because he hath done great things. So, again, there's lots of parallel verses, but if they're the same, where do they fit? Now, quite a few Bible scholars are talking about the war of Gog and Magog being in the second seal. And they say that, I think, in part because they're trying to get it very early in the tribulation period, if not before the tribulation period, because there's a curious reference in the Ezekiel 38-39 war that after the war is over, it's in, I think, chapter 39, they burn the weapons for 7 years. And the argument is, how could the Jewish people be burning the weapons into the millennial reign of Christ if this happened even at the beginning of the tribulation period? It must happen before that to give time for the Jewish people to collect the weapons and to burn them for 7 years. So I'm going to argue that actually I believe this war of Gog and Magog is in seal 4. And there's a couple little tidbits. Both seal 2 and seal 4 talk about war. But you get a couple of interesting other tidbits in seal 4 that I think cement that this is the parallel set of activities. It's the war of Gog and Magog. The first one is this verse here in Revelation 6, and I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and he had sat on it, has a name. It was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given to him over the fourth part of the earth to kill with a sword, with hunger, with death, and with the wild beasts of the earth. And this beast of the earth is the Greek word therion. You can take a look at therion in the book of Revelation and do a keyword search, and what you'll find out is that therion is the beast coming up out of the bottomless pit. It's also a picture of the Antichrist in Revelation 13, a picture of what's called the false prophet also in Revelation 13. And so it's a demonically inspired being of some sort, whether it's a human or whether it's something else, I can't tell you. But the reason why I think the war of Gog and Magog fit there is you've got these therion beasts in seal 4, and now listen to this in Joel 2, what I believe is a parallel description to this beast of the earth that are killing. Neither shall one thrust another, they shall walk every one in his path, and when they fall upon a sword, they shall not be wounded. They shall run to and fro in the city, they shall run upon the wall and climb up upon the houses, and they shall enter into the windows like a thief. And the description of this same army in Joel 2 appears to be not totally human. If they can fall on a sword and not be wounded, and if they can march in this orderly way right through the windows and buildings, there's something not completely human there. So we have a few facts. There's a war being depicted in the fourth seal. There's these not completely human people, entities that make up the army that are killing in parallel verses here. And then the last thing that's kind of a trigger is this notion here, and the pale horse, and his name set on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And the reason why I think this is really important is that links us to the covenant that's going to be signed with the Jewish people. I want to just come down here then and say, now we're going to be right at this part in the story. This army coming down to Israel, is it the overflowing scourge of Isaiah 28, 15 to 18? Let's go take a look at what that says. Isaiah 28, 15 to 18. Because we have said we have made a covenant with death and with hell. What did we see up there in seal 4? Who showed up on the scene? A pale horse, and a name set on was Death, and hell followed after him. So whether this is a personification or whether these are entities that are behind the covenant, they have to be on the scene, the fourth seal, for them to sign a covenant with the Jewish people. And so it's a covenant with death and hell, and we are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. And that's why I think the covenant with the Jewish people has to do with stopping this overflowing scourge. If you remember the war of Gog and Magog, they come out of Russia, they come out of the stands, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, all that. They come out of Turkey, and they come out of northern Africa. So it's this huge army, probably Islamic, coming after Israel, and they actually get into the mountains of Israel. We see that in Ezekiel 39 before God puts an end to it, and they all die on the mountains of Israel. God, kills them with hailstone and whatever. And so I believe, though, that that's the activity, so that God says they will know me, their Lord. But the Antichrist, I believe, is there with the signing of the covenant, and in my humble opinion, it's to stop the overflowing scourge from passing through Israel. And so I think seal 4 introduces death and hell, and that then allows the covenant to be signed with the Jewish people. I think those things go together at that point. So we have the covenant being signed somewhere just after seal 4, and that covenant is the thing that kicks off, or the confirmation of the covenant is what kicks off the tribulation period, according to Daniel 9, verse 27. So you see how the linkages here between the war of Gog and Magog and the parallel in Joel can tell us a lot. Matter of fact, let's take a look at these last verses because we have the timing down pretty good with these parallel verses, but you get to the end of Joel, the Spirit pours out. We talked about that in verse 28. What do you get in verse 31? The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And so there you're right at the end of Joel 2. The sun goes black and the moon to blood. What does that line up with? Revelation, the sixth seal. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black, the sackcloth, and the moon became blood. And Joel is telling us it's just before the terrible day of the Lord is here, right? So there we've got our timing. I think we've nailed it. When is the day of the Lord begin? It's right after the sun goes to darkness and the moon to blood, which is the sixth seal. And I think that's kind of neat, saints. So I know even to get to this point, you guys are brave if you've held in there. But we've pulled together a whole bunch of these pieces that tell the story right there in Revelation 6. And we've got the covenant with the death and hell. We've got it tied to the war of Gog and Magog. We know the timing of that because of Joel. We know it's just before the day of the Lord. lots of good pieces, and then we know it's the covenant that starts the tribulation period, which is also known as the day of the Lord. Okay, and we just got done saying that the last thing Joel tells us before the day of the Lord starts is that the sun goes to black and the moon to blood, which is the sixth seal. The last point I want to make is, let's go here back to Revelation on this point and review the last couple of verses. So this is after the sixth seal, and the kings of the earth said, mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day has come, who shall stand? And it's interesting, it's the wrath of the Lamb. And I know the word wrath throws a lot of people about pre-wrath, rapture, and whatever. Let's think about this. The wrath of the Lamb, if this is the day of the Lord, the great day has come, how does that make sense? And in my Bible study, I ran across that it makes perfect sense. Let's go to John 5:22. For the Father judgeth no man, but hath committed all judgment to the Son. Wow. And so if judgment is going to rain down and start the tribulation period, if the scroll is completely opened by Jesus, who is the one that is the only one that could open the scroll, doesn't that fit? Jesus is the one bringing the judgment, not the Father God in this case. And so why is the day of the Lord tied then to the wrath of the Lamb? It's because it needs to be Jesus doing this. For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. And in Matthew 28, it confirms, and Jesus came again to them, saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And there's several more verses that we can look at that kind of confirm this. And so the fact that it's the wrath of the Lamb and that Jesus is opening the scroll, for me, nails the fact that the day of the Lord begins when Jesus is the one that brings the tribulation, and Jesus is the one that opened the seals, that was the only one worthy to redeem the world. So I think that's a very cool biblical point that you can get out of that. I want to follow up on one of these last things. Now, we read the verses a couple of times about in Joel 2 toward the end. It shall come to pass afterwards that I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters will prophesy, old men will dream dreams. That's promised actually there in Ezekiel 39 too. Neither will I hide my face anymore from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, says the Lord God. And you can even see that again in Ezekiel 37, the dry bones that everybody knows about. The dry bones are gathered together, right, and they stand up and they're a big army. And they come out of the graves, and then listen to this last verse in the dry bones. And shall put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I shall place you in your own land, and you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and performed it. Well, that's the same language at the end of Ezekiel 39. He's doing it so that they know that the Lord has done it. Their Lord has done it, and he puts his spirit within them. And so there's a promise specifically to the Jewish people to receive the Spirit. And according to Joel, it pours out actually onto all flesh. And so I know we have the notion of once the church is gone, the Spirit's in heaven, indwelling the church. But we do see this outpouring of the Spirit promised to the Jewish people, and then to Joel to all flesh. And I think we have the timing of it already given to us. It's just before the terrible day of the Lord comes. So we have that outpouring of all flesh. And now, how do you see this in Revelation? I think that's easy as well. In Revelation 7, starting the first few verses, that I saw another angel coming from the east, having the seal of the living God, and cried with a loud voice the four angels whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth and the sea or the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God in the forehead. Well, is that the same seal then that the church received? The indwelling of the Spirit is talked about a couple of different times in Paul's epistles, as we're sealed until the day of the Lord, until the day of our redemption, as a down payment and a guarantee. I forget the exact language, but that sealing is happening here again. To who? The Jewish people. Matter of fact, the 12 tribes are the ones being sealed here. And so it's very interesting that we see the outpouring of the Spirit potentially in Scripture at this time. After the sixth seal, we see the outpouring of the Spirit. And we see in Revelation 7, if it's after the sixth seal, this is the very next set of verses, the 144,000 get sealed. I think that's really intriguing. It's a fulfilled promise of Ezekiel 39 and 37. I know Dr. Andy Woods in this case wonders if Ezekiel 39, maybe there's a gap in time and it's out at the end of the tribulation period. I think he has the assumption that you have to resurrect the Old Testament saints or whatever before the Jewish people can be sealed. But I think we see the Jewish people receiving the Holy Spirit right here in Revelation 7, and it matches those other verse references I gave you. So I came to a conclusion a couple of weeks ago, looking at all of this, that Joel 2 actually is being fulfilled as a near-far prophecy. And I'll say this quick for people that aren't familiar with Bible prophecy. A near-far prophecy is known in the Bible as a Bible prophecy technique that God used. Another example of this is the destruction of Babylon. If you read it in Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51, it compares well with Revelation 17 and 18. And yet there was a past Babylon at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, his grandson, I guess, where Babylon was taken by the Medes and Persians. And that's pictured there in the dream Daniel gets in Daniel 2. And it's confirmed again in God's view of these kingdoms on earth. I believe it's Daniel 7. Don't hold it to me. But it's the Medes and the Persians come and capture Babylon. But they capture it without a fight. What they do is they divert the water of the rivers Euphrates, which flowed through the center of Babylon back in the day. And that lowered water level allowed them to get under the city gates and get into the city, and they took it without a fight. It was the night of the handwriting on the wall. If you read that back in Daniel, they took it without a fight. And yet, although that fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy about the Medes and Persians taking Babylon, all the details did not get fulfilled. Babylon was not destroyed that night. And yet it is destroyed, or depicted as being destroyed, as the home of jackals and all this in Isaiah 13, 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51. So where does that leave us? Well, there's another destruction of a future Babylon coming, and we read that in Revelation 17 and 18. And in this version of Babylon being destroyed, it is in fact taken completely. Babylon is pictured again as being destroyed in Isaiah's prophecy, but that didn't happen until we get to Revelation 18, verses 21 to 24. Let's take a quick look. And a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, thus with violence shall the great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more. And with voice of harpers and musicians and pipers and trumpeters shall heard no more. and no craftsman whatsoever shall be found any more in thee, and the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more in thee, and the light of a candle shall shine no more in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall no more be heard in thee. And thou merchants were great men of the earth, for by their sorceries were all nations deceived, and in her was found the blood of the prophets, the saints, and all that were slain on the earth. And so here you see in Revelation 18 sort of that more complete fulfillment of the destruction of Babylon. So it's a near fulfillment a few hundred years after Isaiah's day. I think it was 539 BC. Isaiah prophesying in 700 BC that Babylon was taken by the Medes and Persians, and yet the city was left intact at that point. And even a few hundred years later, Alexander the Great finished his conquering of the known world, and he settled back in Babylon and died there. So the city had not been destroyed by the Medes and Persians. But that was detailed out in Isaiah 13, 14, and Jeremiah. So the near fulfillment was the Medes and Persians taking Babylon without a fight back in Daniel's day, but the far fulfillment is yet future. These verses about a future Babylon we read where it truly is destroyed and no more inhabited, and we see that in Revelation 18. So you see a near fulfillment, but then a more complete far fulfillment. What do we have then? If we look at what happened on the day of Pentecost when the church was born, we can read Acts 2, 16 to 21. But this is that which is spoken of by the prophet Joel, and it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, that I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and daughters will prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaids I'll pour out in those days my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs on the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. And the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that the great and noble day come. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so, yeah, Peter was relating, this is a fulfillment by Joel. The Spirit was poured out on the 120 in the upper room. And you see that it's all right here. But missing from that description is the sun going black and the moon to blood, and a couple of those other details there. And so it's not a complete fulfillment, would be what I'm going to argue, even though Peter quotes Joel as saying this is being fulfilled, this is fulfilling what Joel had said. And yet, now if we look, we've got the far fulfillment, and that's what I was arguing a few minutes ago, that in Revelation 6, after the sixth seal, we already noted, because we could see it in the parallel verses in Ezekiel and in Joel, that the Spirit gets poured out when you actually have the sun going dark and the moon to blood, and the Spirit is poured out. And so there I think you can finally see that Joel's prophecy was partially fulfilled during Peter's day, but the final fulfillment of the sun going black and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord is actually fulfilled here in the sixth seal. And then according to Joel and Ezekiel and a couple of different places, that Spirit is poured out again. The far fulfillment is the final fulfillment of the Joel 2 prophecy, is what I'm arguing. Now, we all know, hopefully, that Acts 2, that day of Pentecost, was also known as the Jewish feast of Shavuot. And I want to show you an article, because Shavuot is a Moedim for covenants. So let's just take a quick look at that. This is the Torah.com, and they're relating the timing that you can get, and part of this is supported by the non-biblical work of the Jubilees, but also part of this is directly right in the Bible. So we're not hanging our hat on a non-canonical source. But in Jubilees, it mentions that, yes, on Shavuot, the covenant with Abraham was struck, that the birth of Isaac, the fulfillment of the covenant was also given, and that the covenant with Laban, for Jacob and his wives happened on a Shavuot. And then if you go down more, the covenant with Noah, he gets off the ark and he sets up the altar. God says, the rainbow is your symbol. That covenant happens on Shavuot. They believe Shavuot was in the first week of creation. There was also Mount Sinai. When the Jews got to Mount Sinai after the Exodus, it was Shavuot. Now, I know in the New Testament it's called Pentecost, the Greek word, but it was the Jewish feast of Shavuot. It's the time of covenants. So what was the covenant back in Peter's day? And it was the church receiving the new covenant. And we're told that in Hebrews 8, 6 through 13. Let's go through that. My eyes are getting tired here. Here we go. Hebrews 8, 6 through 13. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for a second. But finding fault with them, he said, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So they're finding fulfillment, and we're going to see it in a minute, in the new covenant, which is in Jeremiah 31. And even though it says with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, it's being relayed that this is what happened on the day of Pentecost with the death and resurrection of Jesus on the day of Pentecost. Hebrews 6 is applying that to the church age, including the grafted in Gentiles. So lots of churches are named New Covenant Church, right, or whatever. But if you go read these verses, that new covenant was actually given to Jeremiah for the Jewish people. And so we may be seeing here again an early fulfillment, a near fulfillment, just like we saw a few minutes ago when Peter did his speech the day of Pentecost, and a far fulfillment here after the sixth seal. So the new covenant's confirmed in Luke 22:20, 1 Corinthians 11:25. And we saw there in Joel that the Spirit pours on all flesh as well, into Joel 2, but we also see it is specific also for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So let's see where that new covenant is defined in Jeremiah 31. And it's in verses 31 to 40. For behold, the days come, saith the Lord, they'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers. In that day I took them by the hand and bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husbandman to them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And it goes down. You can keep reading that there, but the important part, I think, is again seeing that not all the details were fulfilled when Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost, and when Hebrews 8 talks about the new covenant having arrived. It wasn't to the house of Israel and the house of Judah specifically. It was actually given to those that are going to believe in Christ, the church first. And we saw the confirmation of that in the scriptural references here, not only in Hebrews, but Luke and 1 Corinthians. So I'm saying that the new covenant is actually now given to the Jewish people here after the sixth seal. And one more confirmation of that is this. In Revelation 7, when I talked about, well, here the Spirit is being poured out, who is it being poured out onto, or who's it being sealed onto? It's to the whole house of Israel, the northern tribes and the southern tribes, right? That is the final fulfillment of Jeremiah 31, the new covenant. So you can see a near fulfillment at the time of Peter, and the time of Pentecost, on the day of Shavuot, the covenant feast, throughout all history. And then I'll argue we're at another Shavuot because of all those parallels we've already painted and the outpouring of the Spirit on the whole house, both the northern 10 tribes and the southern tribes, right here in Revelation 7, for a final fulfillment of the new covenant promise given to Jeremiah, which was for Jeremiah's people, right? In Jeremiah 30, right before this, Jeremiah is talking about the time of Jacob's trouble. Jeremiah warning them that they're going to go through what we know as the tribulation period. But then he shows them that there is going to be light at the end of the tunnel. There is going to be a blessing, and it's going to be this new and better covenant. And he talks about that in the very next chapter, chapter 31. So I just want to end, I guess, saints, appreciate everybody that's hung in with me through a real long Bible study. But I don't think anybody has ever pulled together, I am not aware of anybody that's pulled together all the pieces and pictured the day of the Lord right after the sixth seal in Revelation, seeing it as a near far fulfillment of prophecy of Joel 2, near fulfillment at the time of Peter and Pentecost, far fulfillment here at the end of seal 6, and the sealing of the 144,000 in Revelation 7. That's a Shavuot, the time for covenants. I've never heard of anybody pull that in and see it as the final fulfillment of the promise in Jeremiah 31. And so, saints, I just offer up, if you think I left the rails, be kind in the comments. If you think that you got a few Bible nuggets here, then just praise the Lord, because it felt like a download from the Lord. God bless.